Not excellent for me, but excellent for you. All right. Okay, great. So we were interested in the leadership section about having some discussions about competitive grants and the value of them and the way to think about them as they're becoming more and more important as looking for funding sources and ways to interact. And so we thought it might be useful to have some different perspectives of how people view competitive grants. So I'm Haley Chenard. I'm the department head at Colorado State University. I've been at that position for 5 years now. We are a department that I think is pretty scrappy and sort of, I think, punches above our weight. And so competitive grants have played an important role for us. So that's to some degree my perspective. So, okay, how do I make it advance? So keep in mind, these are just my thoughts, right? These are just my perspective coming from a smallish, scrappy department where grants are really important. Throughout my academic history, people have always talked about, are grants an input or an output, right? And I used to always think they're an input, just an input. They're just an input. They're part of the things I use as a faculty member to produce outputs. Now, as an administrator, I see the other side of the coin. We're thinking about them as outputs. And I don't know if outputs is exactly the right word. So I've also thought, grants in my mind generate sort of private goods for the person obtaining the grant, but they also generate public goods for the department. And to not recognize that, I think, is missing part of the puzzle. So I don't want to have a discussion about whether they're inputs or outputs. I just want to think about they are part of the portfolio of resources that come into the department that are more managed by the PI. But I think thinking about them as things that generate goods for the PI and the people on the grant, but also the department is important. And then thinking about encouraging faculty to write grants and do that, we need to think about the trade-offs of doing that, the benefits and the costs. So that's the way I'm thinking about these things. So grants clearly benefit research, right? So for the individual, for the folks who've attained the grant, right, it's going to increase the size and scope of what you can do, right? Obviously, this is sort of the input argument. It's a fantastic input into your research. It's going to provide probably faculty summer funding. It's going to fund students. At least in my department, when grants are prioritized as we're allocating students to tasks, PIs are early on in getting to choose which students they get to work with. So that's, of course, a benefit to faculty as well, or to the PIs as well. I also think it's an important signal that you're doing important work. And if you have repeated grants, that you do quality work, right? So I think for the individual, this can be a great signal. And this is part of the P&T discussion about grants, that grants can provide a nice signal that you're doing important, very strong work. I give a little gap there because now I'm thinking about, to some degree, what happens for the department, right? So for my department in particular, it's incredibly important to have grant funds in order to build and really sustain our graduate program. We don't have a lot of additional funds that come in otherwise. So people who are bringing in grants are keeping our graduate program vibrant. And everyone who wants to work with graduate students, wants to teach in a graduate program, wants to have a program with graduate students, benefits from the grants that are coming in and supporting the graduate students. I think it also, the grant portfolio of a department will also signal to external folks the quality of the department. Again, these are just the way I see these things. Grants benefit teaching. Grants give great experience to our graduate students. They get to do the work. They get to be involved in presenting the work. They engagement with funders, perhaps being part of writing grant proposals or writing reports. It's a great place for students to be trained. So I think it's a great benefit to the students. This may be a benefit to the PI if they have repeatedly used the same students, but this is something that may be a great benefit really to the program. Same with undergraduates, right? More and more undergraduate discussions talk about students needing to be engaged in research. So we're looking for ways to engage them. This can also be a great experiential learning, right? The buzzword of the decade, experiential learning. This is a great opportunity for undergraduates. And so I think that these kinds of research opportunities attract both undergraduates and graduate students to the program, which I think is really can be a private benefit, but also a benefit to the department as a whole. Grants can also benefit engagement. We have a lot of folks involved in engagement at Colorado State. They are working a lot with stakeholders to identify problems, to identify questions that are important to them. And so this really gives an opportunity for our researchers to really be providing really impactful engagement and helping stakeholders. And I think, again, this really generates a reputation. It can be private, but also public, right, for the individual and for the department. Again, now grants generate department funds, right? It generates some resources for me. So covering the cost of students, stipends, tuition, travel to meetings, those things can all come off of grants. And that's incredibly important for a department like mine. I also get a portion of the indirect costs that come into the university, flow to the college, flow to me. I give a portion of them back to the PIs, but I also maintain some of that in order to run some operations in the department. I also, twice a year at least, I face a college leadership retreat where we stay on campus, which doesn't feel like much of a retreat, but part of that. And I am shown a pie chart for every department in the college about where our funds come from. And if my grant dollars are bigger, I can talk about the return on investment. For every base dollar you give me, we turn that into how many dollars, which justifies getting a bigger piece of the base dollars from the upper administration, right? So grant dollars, the individual grant dollars, as I pool those together, they help me justify, I need more base dollars. Look what I do with that. Look what my scrappy bunch does with that. So it's really important for the department funding. They're also costly. And to some degree, the faculty really bear that burden, right? So writing grants well is really challenging. Faculty are going to need to spend time probably taking trainings, working with others. They're going to have to repeatedly submit grants. It's costly, and I think we need to recognize that. These interdisciplinary grants, we know they're becoming more and more popular. These are really time consuming because to generate a functional interdisciplinary group who can generate something valuable is a very costly process. And to say it's not, I think is not valid. Also, some folks may be doing work now. We're mostly applied folks. So this shouldn't apply to a huge number of people, but there may be people in your department that just are currently working on things that are not particularly hot or fundable at the moment. In 2019, I had a faculty member who was struggling getting funding for dealing with infectious disease. It turns out it's not a problem for him anymore, but it was. We had this discussion. We literally 2 months before COVID, the start of 2020, we had the discussion. And it's incredibly valuable work, but it's not always fundable. So these are some things to consider, I think, on the cost side. So from my perspective, should faculty members pursue grants? I think the answer is yes. I think it's incredibly valuable to the department, to them, for their work. And I think it also is an important signal in the P&T process. There are some people out there, when you ask for reviews, they're going to really look unkindly if you don't have grant dollars. So I think everyone needs to do it for themselves and for the department. I also strongly believe in the portfolio approach to management, that not everyone has to do everything exactly the same. So I believe that we need to encourage them to do it, but recognize that there are different strengths and that there are different challenges that people face. So for me, I talk with my folks and we talk about your grant dollars are lower. So you may need to, if I need someone to teach a class, I'm going to come to you first, right? So that what happens in the department, if you're not contributing in that space, you're maybe further up the line of being asked to do some other things that will provide public goods to the department. So that's my approach. So I would recommend folks who are uncertain about spending lots of time on grant writing and fulfilling the needs of the grants is to really talk with your administrator, talk with your mentors, talk with folks in the department to see what their view is and how they might, at least initially, work with a mentor writer, not be the PI, but move on sort of through that cycle. So those are just my thoughts. I don't know, Lori, if you want to take questions now or at the end.
Time to take some questions.
So this is just my perspective. Any questions? Yeah, Lori.
So would you recommend even junior faculty do it?
I really recommend that junior faculty work with hopefully a mentor. So in my department, we have mentor committees that are across sort of the subdisciplines. And we have some folks who are, I think, really willing to bring people on as sort of not PIs, but cooperators. And so I would highly recommend that junior folks partner with people in areas that they're interested in to go through that process to get into it, to understand what it is. And there are people in my department who are exceptional grant writers. So we will, every 2 years or so as we bring new people on, I'll ask those folks to do a little grant writing workshop, where to go, what it looks like, what it needs to be, and have them review junior folks' grant proposals as well. So inside the department, having mentorship in this space, I think is really vital. I don't know if that answered your question. Chris?
Does your college have a grants office?
Yes. We have a great grants office that is phenomenal with pre-award. Post-award, not so much, but pre-award is fantastic. So, but that's really helpful, right? To especially those folks who are new to that. But that's a key resource, which I didn't really mention, but a lot of, so the burden kind of falls to the faculty folks and then the people who help, not so much me. Yeah, Rachel.
So what do you do about people who apply for grants, including from some very fancy sources that don't give any indirect cost return? What's your strategy for managing the costs that are generated for the department when there's no offsetting?
Right. So we don't have a lot that are from the, so, even USDA is below the regular indirect rate. So basically what I do, I give everyone a ridiculously small, but what I can afford amount of operating. And then I give a proportion of indirects back to people who have grants. So that way everyone, if you can, for me, I let them roll it over so they can save up money to buy a new computer, et cetera. And then if they're at places that provide indirects, they get a portion of that back.
And if they don't, then how is the department subsidizing and administrating those grants? Is it just the cost you take on? Are you? I'm talking about zero overhead.
Right.
Yeah.
So we haven't had many of those. We really just haven't. And again, I give everyone operating, and then they also can come see me if they need something specific. So you could talk with them. I feel like they're okay with how it's going. But I don't have a great answer to that other than I give everyone in the department an operating budget, and then they get extra with the indirects they generate.
Just out of curiosity, what is your standard?
It's like horrifying. It feels so evil. It's like 51% because they want more than half, right? Which is like, it's like, oh, it's like it couldn't be 49 and let the PI have, have him, at least they don't take half. But yeah, it's for 51. Any other questions? I'm happy to talk later also, so we can keep moving. Thank you. End slideshow?
Yeah.
Oh,
no,
I don't know. I don't want to maybe up here. I don't want to end sharing. There we go. Oh, no, there we go. Okay, excellent. Thanks, Lori.
No matter how many times you use it.
It's just different. Why is it different? Okay, so now we're going to have Keith Cobley talk to us about an administrator's viewpoint, since he's currently the vice president.
Hey.
I'm used to it now. I have and I don't have a PowerPoint slide, but I've been thinking about this as I flew out, and this another name for my presentation is things I've learned in the last 18 months. I want to echo a lot of what Haley said about inputs versus output. The provost of our university and I years ago had an argument about inputs versus outputs, and we'll probably continue to argue about that a little bit. But as you move up the administrative change and you've got all these different disciplines and all these different units, it just becomes dollars is the common denominator for everything at the university. As much of a bad signal as that gives, at the end of the day, we crave NSF rankings and research in our various areas, and that's the way it's going to be measured, is in dollars. I want to echo what Haley said as well about, at the end of the day, going after grants does provide funding for graduate students. It ought to be self-serving. As economists, we all know that if you're on a 9-month contract, this is going to put money in your own pocket. And I'm fine with that. And I think that makes sense. I think a distinction that we kind of struggle with is the difference between let's say you get a markets and trade grant from NEFA. How does that compare to a commodity group coming to you and saying, look, we like what you do. We want to fund some work. Give us a 2-page proposal and we're going to fund it. And so it's dollars. They're both dollars. And how do you compare those? The commodity group in our state is probably going to show up. They're going to do that, and they're not going to be willing to pay any overhead, which makes my counterpart over at the Office of Research unhappy. And in our shop, we basically have cooperative agreements with USDA agencies and with producer groups, and this is a lightning rod issue. I know some administrators that are now at other institutions because they tried to get overhead out of in-state commodity groups, and so that's a bit of a challenge. One thing that I will say, I think certainly for a faculty member, if you get a highly competitive grant, that will be recognized, as will be publishing in a top tier journal. Okay. The relative weights, I think, are going to vary all over the place depending on where you're at. I think at Mississippi State, if you were to go up for promotion to associate professor and have never written a grant proposal, that's going to be really suspect. I'm just being, and we won't discourage an assistant professor of going after a good grant that makes sense, and being the PI. We have a system in place that I like really well, is that we mentor our assistant professors in grant writing. There's kind of a 2-tier process. There's a short grant training program. We've now hired a grant writer to help full-time basis, but that grant writer is going to focus on big ticket multidisciplinary projects. We need to have more of those, and a lot of your institutions have grant writers. One of the things that I think we need to understand in terms of all this funding is this, and I'm going to appeal to all of you to carry this message out, because it needs to go out. And that is, why are grants so valuable to us today? And when I interviewed at Mississippi State, when Barry interviewed at Mississippi State, we were told, don't worry about writing grants. We don't tell anybody that anymore. And the reason is because the real value of the state funding and the federal funding, the formula funding that we get from at our institutions has declined over time. And the one thing that I have gotten a little bit of connection with people, I have a story, and it's a true story, of where I was in China at Beijing talking to American trained economists who said our government intends to catch and surpass the United States in ag research. That is true. They had caught us just about the time that I was there, and now they're double us. And people in the United States do not understand. And I kept thinking all through this trade war with China, people do not know that there is another battle going on with China. And some people are going to fixate on stealing science. I'm much less so. But the fact that they are dropping more money into research than we are in the United States, and the people that benefit from that don't know it. And so I think we need to tell that story every chance we get. And it will, because in fact, we're doing triage with these going out and going after funding, where 30 years ago, that wasn't such an essential part of what we did because we had more comprehensive funding. Let's talk about overhead. I have spent 17 months of my 18 months in this role discussing overhead, how it is handled, who gets to keep it. I have looked at inside our institution. I have looked at other institutions. I have talked to my counterparts. What is done with overhead at our institutions is all over the place. We have 4 off-campus research and extension centers who share with the faculty at that center 0% to 100% of the overhead off their projects. I'm like, and we've done a survey across the university, and it's just all over the place. I think a little bit of it makes there's some rhyme to the reason to what they're doing, but it's like our scientists in the ag units at Mississippi State, they use the sponsored programs office that helps us send things out there. Well, who's going to pay for those people over there? And ultimately, the vice president of research pays for them. So how much should we contribute to them? And questions like that. I am convinced that the cost of doing research for the U.S. government and other entities is going to keep going up. Regulatory compliance costs are not going down. They're going up. Data security issues going up, not down. And so those are some of the things that we're going to end up talking about. I sympathize, Haley, when you think about how high these overhead rates. There are factors that go into that are very legitimate. When somebody has to put a roof over your office, it's got to be paid for in some form or fashion. When somebody pays light bill in your office, it matters. I think one of the things that one needs to realize is how do we incentivize people to generate overhead. And one of the things that I'm pushing, I have not succeeded yet, is to make sure that scientists are rewarded more for bringing in grants that have overhead versus don't have overhead. We're going to take the promotion board funding that comes from the soybean promotion board, and it has 0 overhead, and we're going to continue to work with those people. And pragmatically, we're going to do so because they will go to the state legislature during the legislative session and fight for us, and we need allies. But on the other hand, they're not helping pay for the roof, the $900,000 roof on a small building that we've got to do, and things like that. A few things that I have seen in my role outside of ag economics that I think might be of useful for you. One is, I talked about the mentoring program that we have been doing for a long time to help young faculty learn how to write grants. But we're talking very seriously. My associate VP is leading a task force on this, and I have an intern in my office that's working with her to look at the mid-career faculty. We kind of say, okay, we've trained you how to write grants now, and we want an entrepreneurial faculty. That's what all the administrators want. They want a faculty that will go out and get grants and talk to an agency and make these connections and bring in these dollars. But you think about a small scale entrepreneur. You hire a young faculty member, they get started, they start growing. Well, if you're in specialty crops, what do? You try to scale up from part-time to full-time, and you hit the wall. I think we have the same thing going on among our faculty. Is at some point you're successful in this area and you find out that I've got 8 $40,000 grants and I can't do anything but fill out quarterly reports. And I think and you need to change the way you operate and so forth. So we're looking very seriously at a model where we're going to take our younger faculty that have kind of reached that point in their career and help them in various ways in terms of how do you manage a big project. And I think, to be honest, hard scientists with their lab model are more comfortable with this transition than economists are. And so, you know, an economist that has 3 postdocs, 4 PhD students, 2 master's students to scale up to that scale. Rudy, you were there at one point in your career, I think. But how do you go from being the sole scientist collaborating with 2 or 3 co-authors down the hall to having a big operation? And Rudy can probably talk about this more, but I think finding the way to go from being a productive young faculty to that, it's a bumpy ride, and we want to help our faculty do that better. And we're going to try to provide some training on that. I think the other thing that from a promotion standpoint, and Haley touched on this, even in Ag Econ, you can look up and down the halls and you can say that faculty member ought to be bringing in more grants money because they have a ton of opportunity. And then there's this other person working in another area and you're like, who's going to give them money for what they work on? But it's valuable. I mean, if you work on antitrust issues in the agricultural supply chain, you know, there's going to be times when you're going to get 0. And you're never going to get any data. There's things like that as an administrator, I think you've got to be really careful not to hold everybody to exactly the same standard. Because their opportunity is not equal. And that's where I think as administrators and as P&T committees, we have to use some subjectivity, and that scares us to death. But we're not going to be fair unless we're somewhat subjective. I hate the business school model of evaluating faculty for promotion, this A-list, B-list, C-list kind of model. It's easy, but it doesn't accommodate the realities of different faculty and their circumstances. One other thing that I want to mention to you is that it is my impression from my new role is that you all need to very carefully make the case about the return on investment to social sciences. Almost all of you are a social science in a college full of hard scientists. And what is so striking is that administrators are like, well, the plant science department needs a new greenhouse. It's $3 million. We got to do it. Let's boom. For the most part, all you need is a decent office and an $8,000 computer on your desk, and you're happy. Okay, and a few trips to AAEA a year, and your counterpart over in the plant science department wants a new tractor every 3 years, or a combine, and so my perception is that our average salaries are a little higher than some of these other disciplines. But the cost of our discipline versus a hard science discipline that's heavy in lab science or heavy in field science is amazingly different. And we can get caught in a trap. I had a business manager, we made a call for funding to use Hatch dollars, and the business manager threw out everything from AgEcon, knowing that I was the interim director, because they weren't big enough to mess with. Like, well, we're only going to do $100,000 ticket items or bigger. And I'm like, that's not right. You just threw out all the social scientists. But I think really AgEcon needs to make the case that yes, our salaries are higher, but our startup packages are smaller, and the ROI in terms of bringing in grants and contracts can be equal or better than a lot of these other disciplines. And that's a story, because almost all of you are going to be talking to a hard scientist as an administrator at some point. And I think that difference is something that you need to, a case you need to make. So I'll stop there. Alan?
Is it the ROI?
Not always. Not always.
As you say, when we came in, I was also actively discouraged not to get grants. But they were easy that aren't making
yeah
for us. Yeah, I'm curious, because at that time, at least where I was at, we were rounding. And so it didn't matter. My perception is now that as a discipline, we've moved beyond rounding error within these colleges of agriculture. And so, which is a good thing, but I could be wrong. So it's actually that, have we moved beyond rounding error in these metrics of your metric as vice president?
What I found in my place is that we've got an accounting system that makes it nearly impossible to calculate an ROI, which drives me crazy. I mean, no, I don't think it does. Because I think the argument to make is we're cheaper. You're dropping millions of dollars of infrastructure into these other disciplines that were bench science, for example, or field science. The experiment station just was shelling out money right and left for them. And it may be different at other places, but I don't know that is ever put together with the overhead that is generated by our, and to be honest, a lot of the, at Mississippi State, an awful lot of the dollars that come with zero overhead do not go to the ag economists. I mean, a little bit, but it's mostly going to the animal science, the plant science, people like that, entomologists. And so I think, but I do not know, that AgEcon would come out looking relatively good if that comparison was done accurately.
Because that'd be different than my perception that the ROI on AgEcon may lag behind, or the indirect costs may lag behind on many of our grants versus some of the bench science.
Yeah,
that's good to know that you believe it's the.
I think it's the other way around at our place. I don't know that's true everywhere. Yes.
So I have an argument that's actually been the best one that's worked with
I want
my
to know.
team. And no, so these big multidisciplinary teams that Haley touched on, a lot of them, you're getting grants and you must have an economist. And so my argument is, all right, my person is only generating a tiny share of that, but you wouldn't have, the college wouldn't have gotten this gazillion-dollar grant because it requires an economist, and that's actually kind of worked.
Yeah.
You know, so that's the other ROI. It's not direct. You know, but the point is, if we're necessary input,
That's
then
right.
we should get credit for that. And that's been my strongest argument.
Good for you.
I think that's an important point, and it didn't just happen. And our profession went to bat. if that
Yep,
language fit
exactly.
it. And I think a lot of folks don't remember that. There was a lot of effort that went putting in that language.
And there is,
Exploited now that it's there.
we had a great ally at NIFA at that time that got that in there. Yes.
Keith, I remember one of my first brown bag luncheons at Missouri when Admiral Womack came and spoke. It was first line that it takes money to do quality research. And that was his line. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about that was that he was very interested in us understanding the true cost of research and that process. And sometimes I think that's helpful for faculty, even if they're not in a position to be able to generate it immediately. Professors.
Yeah.
Is that I think the point that you made last night, I think, is very helpful in this process as well. And that's the idea of being able to speak to non-economists about what we do, because so much, a lot of times, beyond some of the big sort of flashy, the holy trinity of NIH and NSF and NIFA with funding regards relationships, working with different stakeholders. They're the ones that write the support letters and everything else, and they're also the ones that if you can speak to them effectively in a language that they can understand, they're also sometimes more willing to work with you to get the budgets that you need to do that, including the indirects that you need.
I think you're right.
All right, thanks, Kate.
Okay.
All right. Now we have our president-elect is going to talk, Rudy Naga, about research metrics and academic success.
I didn't really prepare anything, so I'm just gonna, well, grants are recognized, obviously, when I do annual evaluations with faculty. It's also very much recognized at the college level. When I do when the deans do the annual evaluation for me, they particularly ask me, obviously, the grants accomplishments of the department. In my department, our research grants tend to range from $10 to $15 million a year. So it generates very important IDCs for us. And the reason why IDCs are important, at least for Texas A&M, is because if you're hiring new faculty, the formula at A&M is 1/3 of that startup must come from the department. 1/3 of the cost of that startup. 1/3 from the college, 1/3 from the provost office. I've hired more than 10 faculty members since I joined. And startups are becoming really an important competitive attribute now, right? To attract new faculty. So I need those IDCs to be able to provide attractive startup packages. So IDCs are important. Having said that, I agree with Keith that subjectivity, you need some subjectivity in it, because I have faculty that are not, they don't really need big grants to be successful in their research program. I have an econometrician, for example, who does a lot of really good things without the need for big NIFA grants. So you got to take that into account, when evaluating different faculty. So yeah, startups are important. They also fund our graduate students, PhD students. Our model is we normally fund our new PhD students during the first year. And once they pass their qualifiers after the first year, then the faculty tend to take them on their different research projects and grants. And that really sustains our PhD program. We have more than 60 PhD students, and the department can't fund all of those, right? I mean, that's a huge expense. And so for our PhD program to be sustainable, the faculty really need to get grants, to sustain our graduate program. For P&T considerations, there's no question that since we're in the College of Agriculture, at least at Texas A&M, grants is considered an output. No question about it. So when we have people who are coming up for promotion and tenure, or promotion only, and if they don't have as much grants, I instruct my P&T committee to really explain very carefully, and I do it as well in my own letter, right? Explain very carefully why this particular faculty member doesn't have as much grants as expected in the hard sciences. You really have to very carefully explain that to the P&T. And that's really more important at A&M, because in our college, we have a representative. The Ag Economics Department has a representative in the P&T committee, the college P&T committee. But our representative is not allowed to discuss or promote our own candidate in the P&T committee, which is kind of strange if you think about it, right? What their argument is that if your candidate is really good, then just put them in writing in those letters, right? You don't need the representative to explain the value of this faculty member at the college level. That's their argument. And obviously there's some conflict of interest issues as well that they want to avoid. So grants are important, and part of my job is, if I have new faculty member or even existing faculty members, I really work hard in promoting them in other units, not just within the college, but also outside of our college. Get them so they'll know more people, and I agree that so that's important for people to know your faculty, right? Because they can then be invited in multidisciplinary grants. So that's becoming a big part of my job as well, especially for new faculty members. In terms of ROI, I agree. I think we are important. Many of my faculty are invited in big grants. And I agree, they wouldn't have probably received those grants without an economist. I just talked to our dean, our director for research last week, and he's telling me that Texas is big, right? So we have a lot of research and extension centers around the state, and he told me that I think 9 out of I don't know how many, 9 of maybe 12 research centers around the state have asked him for an economist. Now that tells you the value of ag economists, right? Why? Because they think if they have an economist in their own center, they'd be a lot more competitive, in their grants. And many of them even argue that this is going to be a washout, that if you give me an economist, I can guarantee you that the revenues is going to far outweigh the cost of hiring the economist. But obviously, he told me he can't really afford to hire 9 new ag economists for all the centers. So his plan is to hire a core of ag economists, maybe 4 or 5, that can serve then all these various research and extension centers. So that indicates to me that we do have high ROI, I think. And when I compare the research grants from my department with other departments, in the college, I think we're very comparable, even higher in some regard. So anyway, I think those are the only ones. Do you want me to talk about research metrics?
Yes.
Okay. What about the research metrics? Well, research is important, right? So publications are very important. And since I came as department head, I've been emphasizing to faculty that quality matters. I want my department to be a consistent top 10 department down the road. We used to be a top 10 department. We eroded quite a bit in the last 10, 20 years. Chris knows that. You're an Aggie, Chris, right? During our time, Keith was my cohort as well. During my time, we were consistently top 10. Also in publications, AAEA, but that's eroded quite a bit in the last 10, 20 years. Now, will that happen overnight? No, that's going to take a while. Right? The good news is we've been hiring a lot of good people lately, so we'll see. So quality matters in terms of the research metrics. And I've warned many of my faculty not to even publish in quote unquote predatory journals. I just have to be honest with you, especially MDPI journals. I warned them specifically not to touch it because there's so much controversy on these MDPI journals that it can even be perceived by external letter writers as a negative rather than a positive. Now, I published in some MDPI journals several years ago without knowing that they tend to be predatory now. I don't know if you guys are active in Twitter, but it's a big discussion on Twitter, right? Just ask Mark Bilmar. He'll tell you. Anything else, Lori, that you want me to talk about? Research? Citations obviously are important. We don't tend to, it's not a requirement yet, especially at the assistant professor level, because it takes time, obviously, to accumulate that citation. In my evaluations, I emphasize just really the quality of the journals. I don't even talk about impact factors. I mean, impact factors are important, obviously, but we all know which ones are the high quality journals in our field, right? Obviously, if they publish in Nature and Science, well, I salute them. I bow to them, but you know, so quality matters at least for me anyway.
How do you guys deal with co-authorship?
Yeah, we encourage co-authorships.
How do you award value or who does more?
I don't really, yeah, we don't, we value first authorships, obviously, but we don't get into this business of assigning, you know, what percentage of that paper belongs to me and what percentage belongs to my co-authors. It tends to be, it's too cumbersome, I think, to do that. And sometimes there can be conflicts in reporting, right? You know, one author might say, oh, I've done 40% of that paper. Another author said, oh, I've done 70% of that paper. Okay, so who's right? So I don't really emphasize on that too much.
One of the things that comes up with us all the time is your reputation. And so, like, what are the signals faculty can use to demonstrate they have a reputation?
Yes, service to good journals. You know, being invited as an editor or associate editor or even an editorial council is a reflection, I think, of reputation. Publications, obviously, in good journals can be a good source of reputation, right? Being invited in panels is an indicator. I think we all know what those are, right? I mean, I don't know. Anyone else who can contribute to that question?
I think we look at a lot more at the goal. I mean, that goal citations matter a lot. By then you should. But I know a few cases where people cited because everyone thought they were wrong. Right.
Yeah.
Again, that's something to.
I'm just thinking, I don't know, but like you're saying, being invited, and it's sort of like, well, what do I do so that someone invites me? Like, what proactive thing can I do so I get invited to a panel or get invited to be on an editorial board?
Oh, I don't know. You can self-promote yourself, I guess, but it's not. I don't know. It's Keith.
You know, I can remember when we created sections. I remember that there was a pretty strong debate as to whether this was good. I am strongly a believer that it was a great thing that we went to sections because it, you know, sections are smaller groups, they're more tightly defined, and they're an opportunity for young people to get their first step into this organization. And it looks good on your, okay, you're the chair-elect of BAMP section of AAEA when you go up for associate professor. We take that as a signal, okay, there was a vote and you got elected into your section. Now there may only, you and I both know that there may have only been 25 people voting.
Or you're the only candidate.
Or you're the only candidate. But for how many of us, that was kind of our first step.
Yeah.
And I think it gives people in our profession a way to start. You know, you get in, then you get into the prep session and things like that. I think sections have helped our faculty get promoted.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, that's a good point, Keith. Yeah.
Multi-state projects also really help you connect to people who are doing more relevant to what you're doing.
Right now, in the department, it's on like a younger generation and becoming administrators. And I do believe that senior faculty open doors. So we're talking about how they get engaged, how they get promoted. But for me, having key individuals in good positions that understand that you need that hand to move forward.
Yeah.
And I agree with you, multi-state projects. I mean, in my case, becoming, and I can joke of being the only candidate for a president of a position because nobody else wants to do it, right? But you got there by engaging. In my case, when senior faculty, identifying as being jobs, you can say, how are you become a secretary? Have you thought about it? So we're talking on the other side, but also it takes a lot of all that are on the other side, becoming members and helping those that are going in that direction. Yeah.
So I guess I would juxtapose that and say, well, how would you prefer somebody go after grants or get really involved in sections and stuff? Because I don't have time to do it all. So from a P&T standpoint, where's that balance?
I say do both. I know that we all have time constraints, right? But
so then I would come back to you, the department head, and say, where are my additional resources to help manage this grant portfolio that takes up a ton of time to be able to do these other things that I don't necessarily do?
Yeah, it's I say do what you think is best for you, right?
Who exactly are you posing that question?
Yeah, I see you.
I'll give you a bit of a comment. And I think you want to check all the boxes. So to have zero grant activity is going to be a red flag to a PD, right? And an external. But if you got some, then okay, you're stronger than me. And so I think there's a lot of things. I mean, I know Barry and I've had this conversation. We've had young extension faculty who work a lot with plant science. We're like, you know, so they've got 5 agronomy journal papers. So do they have any? And we're like, and I think Barry may be the person that coined this phrase, that if you got some ag-econ publications, then they all can. But if you don't have any ag-econ publications, those agronomy journal papers don't count. And so I think, you know, I would tell an assistant professor, try to make sure you don't have an empty box.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Once you've done a minimal level, then you can kind of go on. You can lean one way or another.
I'm just trying to figure out how to
Time is to, I mean, it's going to be what role you're going to play. So you're not having from an editor of a journal when you're assistant, because that's going to take away of what really matters going out to the paper, which is publication and grants, correct me if I'm wrong. But you can be the secretary, the VP of project, like roles that you have that do not remain for that much time, but are taking in the right path. So when you become associate, you can be an editor, you can be an associate. So you're kind of like putting the thing there, investing a little bit of time, so you can be there and once you become associate. That's my argument.
I'm going to move us on just in because I don't want anyone to thank you, Rudy. So the next person is Jordan Shockley. He's going to talk to us from the faculty perspective.
Thank you. I don't have a formal presentation either, but a lot of this discussion of what we talked about already. So just for formality, I'm an associate extension professor, 90% extension, 10% teaching. So no formal research, which is pretty common in the southern region. I'm at University of Kentucky, but there is an emphasis of applied research undertones in what I do and what I needed to do to check these boxes. And so I've been pretty successful at getting quite a bit of grants. Been at Kentucky now a total of 7 years. And I just did some quick math earlier that roughly 33% of my grants come from USDA, 33% come from private / NGO, and the other 33% come from commodity board grants. To a total of now probably of well over probably $1.5 million just in commodity money over the time that I've been there. So one thing I want to emphasize is don't forget about the commodity board funding. We can talk about competitive grants, USDA, NIFA, overhead, all of that good stuff, but there's so much low-hanging fruit to be had in the commodity board space. It takes a different type of approach to receive that type of money. It is not just a grant writing session. A lot of that involves face-to-face interaction with the commodity board representatives to have a discussion of what they actually want as far as grant funding. And it has been very easy for me to receive whatever support from those commodity boards that I need. And it's 1 to 2 page effort on a writing standpoint. And we go back to what does success in a faculty member look like. You know, when I started at Kentucky, I was always told, you know, do you have state, regional, national, and international recognition, right? And for me, starting out, because of my position, it started at the state level, because I knew I could not get promoted if I didn't have the backing of stakeholders in Kentucky, specifically the commodity boards. And that kind of drove that approach to the grants and getting involved with interdisciplinary teams. I've made a career doing interdisciplinary work and linking up with colleagues in plant science that opened that door initially to the commodity boards. And now I mean, from our department's perspective, I have the majority of the commodity board funds. And now commodity boards have also changed their requests for applications requiring an economic analysis for everything that the hard scientists are doing. So that now means that I am on more grants than I thought I would be on. So managing that, to Tyler's perspective, is tough. And so having that network early on, getting involved in an interdisciplinary framework, because as has been mentioned already, right, all these USDA grants are requiring economists. and they need to be on there. And I think even more so, they require an extension economist because there's a lot more verbiage on there on the outreach perspective of these grants. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. As far as getting involved and how do you what proactive things you can do from a recognition standpoint, I've always said throughout my time is I don't miss one. There's one meeting that I don't miss a year from a society standpoint, and that's our Southern Extension Committee meetings. It is the most valuable. There's places for leadership that does take a ton of time, but that's also a place where I found where you can present some of your work and even test drive some ideas before you take it out into either research or to your states to do extension programming. And so getting that opportunity to get in front of senior extension faculty gets you that recognition of topics and invitations. I do now probably more invited talks invitation now in my short time than I did before. And so so there's a lot of opportunity. I think it's just young faculty need to be willing to work with other people. And if they're not, there's going to be it's a huge concern, and it's an uphill battle for PNT, in my opinion. As far as the input versus output discussion, unfortunately, I think for younger faculty, including myself, my department's kind of split on this issue. You're being told as a young faculty go out and get grants as much as possible, but then you've got senior faculty who are writing your letters that are saying this is just an input, and it's only an input, it's not an output. And so there's a disconnect, and it's a generational gap, however you want to phrase it. It's a challenge. And how do we address this within the department to make it more of an input or make sure there's an output conversation and value to that? Because for me, I'm 12-month appointment, right? Where is the incentive for me to go get grants? Period. Okay. If there wasn't, especially the larger, more prominent grants, USDA, NIFA, all the good stuff. With that, a financial incentive, I probably wouldn't do it. I'll be strictly honest. So if your departments do not have a financial incentive for faculty, we have we call Wellington Award, that we get half the money salary savings back in our pocket. And I'm not talking in an account per computer. I'm talking a award that comes into my pocket that I can go spend on vacations. Okay. And so if you don't have that, I don't know how you can encourage faculty to write grants. Because if you're like our institution, who here has short-staffed in OSPA and their sponsored projects? Any universities? Yes. It has been an absolute nightmare. Barry, what have you been doing the past 2 months? Right? And it is such a headache. Even this award that's in my pocket is starting to be not worth it. Because why do that headache when I can do everything that I want to do with commodity board money? That's easy. Okay. And so I think that's the key of having the support of your institution. So not even, your sponsor projects office, but even just grant writers in your department, grant writing support. We don't have that. And so figuring out the nuts and bolts is 17 emails back and forth arguing about your letter of intent is a month off. And so you have to redo it, and I almost lost $1 million grant last week because the letter of intent was October and not September. I'm like, what does it matter? Because we're not going to get the money at that time anyway. So, so there's just nuances that are a headache that, again, I encourage you departments to have some financial incentives any way, shape, or form on that. What else? On the commodity board front, because I deal with that a lot. They are also starting to get angry at universities. To the tune of we have to pay our family, our sons and daughters, tuition to go to University of Kentucky. Why do we have to also fund tuition for graduate students? That is the conversation that was had 2 years ago. And now our soybean board does not fund tuition. They will fund stipends, but they will not fund tuition for graduate students. So that obviously has impacted a lot of our plant soil science folks that rely on this money a lot. So if you alienate those resources, it could be a ripple effect coming down the pipeline. So I really encourage you departments to be actively engaged with that group. With that, any questions as far as?
Do you find yourself kind of stuck in that spot where you've grown your program to where you need like project manager or things like that to get bigger for you to keep going?
Yes, and it's Tyler and I have talked about this a bunch. For me, not necessarily a project manager for the grants. It's more of resources to help me run an extension program to the size and scale that it could be. And it's something as simple as maybe an extension associate. You know, we are still a very traditional extension program, right? We have county meetings, and I do, on average about 30 just specifically county meetings a year. So you're on the road, 7-hour round trip, just have to stay the night sometimes. I mean, we're not as large as Texas, but again, it's a lot of time, effort to deliver what we need to do with to our base constituents. That if I had some research to be able to do that, continue that work, but then pursue other options. So it's, but if I were pursuing larger grants, like we just put in the SAS grant last week. And, in those grants, we put in a project manager. Yeah, I think you have to deal with the amount of paperwork and headache that comes with those grants. But I think to take it to the next level, I would need resources to do so. Now, do I want to take it to the next level? That's another question, right? It's I don't have an answer to that quite yet, because I say where's the incentive to do that when, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And to me, my approach is I'm very good at time management. Is one of my specialties, and so I'm very cognizant of not getting too large of a swamp.
So to follow up on that, my question to you would be, what types of programs are you putting in place to help those people make that next jump? So I've got a postdoc getting ready to hire a second postdoc. I've got 4 PhD students, 3 master's students, undergrad students. So I'm tiered. I need a project manager. We walk down that path. A project manager in our space is $90K a year. I've had the project, both of us have taken the project management classes to get our project manager certification. A typical project manager would manage 2 projects. I've got 11. do I keep running on this treadmill or do I jump off this treadmill and let Barry deal with all that?
And to add that, you know, but then,
Lay it out there, Tyler.
but then you've got the problem is you've got Tyler and myself are very active, but then you've got a whole suite of other faculty that haven't applied for a grant in 15 years. So the burden of funding graduate students, funding PhD students is actually landing on junior faculty. And the stress, you know, again, there needs to be an incentive. Because if not, you're not going to have a PhD program. And you may not have a master's program. Is the reality of the situation, and how do you reward and support those that are successful with the right resources? Because from a senior faculty perspective, what do they need to?
So at A&M, most of us are 9 months. So there's an incentive for faculty to really get summer salary.
Mm-hmm.
But at the extension side, I'm struggling because Texas Ivy Life Extension wouldn't allow extension faculty to pay summer salary from federal grants, only from private entities.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to change them because
that could
really incentivize faculty to get big grants from state and federal.
Yep. 100%.
It's an issue that I've been pushing the last 6 months.
Well,
I don't know what the constraints are. How is it exactly? How is it?
that would never fly at our institution. Extension faculty currently. But again, we work, what am I?
So you're allowed to.
Yeah.
You know, we
But
pay
how does the department that you can even put in a grant without putting it in your salary, so.
no, we would be able
A model that we are trying on a limited basis is not 9 months for extension, but it is 75% time. What it means that they're going to but they're only 3 or 4 time. Then they can use grants and contracts to supplement that costs them the 9 versus 12.
Huh.
So the incentive that Jordan talked about, the Wellington Board, is the primary incentive for 12-month faculty. And getting back 50% of your salary savings, there are people, it comes in a check once a year, in May check. We have people that get huge paychecks in May. But Tyler was 9 months. But he can still, so his first goal is going to be summer salary, obviously. But he can then also buy out 9 months salary and get the incentive on 9 months salary as well. So we have the financial incentives, I think, in pretty good shape. The thing that hasn't been talked about here that I think is really important is the burden that our increased dependence on grants puts on our business officers. And the cost, this is a huge cost to, at least to our department, just getting the transactions done. And my business officer estimates that on a per dollar basis, it takes probably 10 times more time to manage a grant dollar than it does an appropriated dollar. And we have not really thought about that. And as we become more and more dependent on grants, the burden it is putting on our business office is huge. Tyler's salary any month is paid out of 11 different grants. And it changes from month to month. And it's just our business officer probably spends a day and a half a month working on Tyler's salary.
I especially want to wait. But the other piece to go along with that is we incentivize the faculty but the staff have no incentive to deal with us on these issues.
And I agree. So I wanted to work on it, like, so a little bit about the savings and then keep forward to comment on that. So we have targeted the traditional sources of funds. So we've been talking about grants, come on, right? I don't know how many statements were released, but in coming into the department head, I realized that we have a set of endowments that as department head, like you probably didn't know that they existed and how to spend. And so going back to, so one of the things that we did is, because you look at the staff salary when compared to other salaries, and then you see them about the work that we have to do, where's the incentive for them? There's no path for them, right? By looking at the endowments we had in the department, there was some flexibility for us to actually incentivize reward for staff that they get reward. There are other things. International, when you go from associate to full, they say internationally recognized. Well, getting an international grant and getting work ethic, it's very limited with an USD grant or with a state grant, right? So we figure out, guess what? We have an endowment of a person who gave more than 20 years ago, and in the wording it says international grant. So we start doing travel awards to faculty so they can travel internationally with more experience. So I don't know, I mean, I've just discovered it. They are thinking to manage endowments, and we have this set of endowments, and some of them have not been paying in years. We didn't know what the link was there and what was the security on that. So I don't know if probably, I don't know if universities can be different, or you have that ability to look at the endowments and see what opportunities come forward. Another thing that I have never seen is foundation one. Going after foundation one is tricky, right? And we're not going to meet the foundation people to gain you. That's probably takes another thing. But I think that's a step that administrators need to take. To think outside of the goal of traditional sources of funding, where faculty are struggling, writing grants, doing this, managing their grants. Why administrators are not putting more effort actually developing those networks that as faculty I cannot develop and take time, but that's not my time, it's an administrator time to bring to the faculty all their sources of funding. So like we try to think about the same sources of funding, but and maybe I'm out of touch, but I've always thought about what we are not on the same sources of funding that we're all competing on, we're all struggling with, but we have not moved forward to think outside of the box and look at all the funding sources. We have not put more emphasis. And you have way more experience than me.
Well,
yeah. We have one more speaker to go, and we're running out of time. So thank you, Jordan. Our last speaker is Rachel. She's coming from UC Davis, and she's going to talk about people who want to be successful in academics who we haven't hired yet.
Yeah, so when I got this assignment from Lori, this specific assignment last week, I'm like, oh man, what am I going to say? I don't want to betray Lori's faith in me, but and I will have a few slides, and I'll skip through them kind of quickly. And first, though, it's been real interesting listening to everyone else, and I would like to make more 2 points on grants specifically, because again, my talk is going to be more about what do we need to do to get our students ready to go on the market. You know, and what contributes to grantsmanship and how much should it, as Tyler's mentioned and Jordan. But the 2 points are the following. So we were just talking about foundations and that, and earlier, I think it was in response to Keith, I said my big, or maybe Haley, no, I think it was Haley. My big issue is, and with the load on staff, are these grants that come in with no indirect cost returns. And often these are reputation building for the faculty member, but that means then that people who get grants with overhead are subsidizing them and not getting the reputational benefit. How to balance that as a chair head is a really tricky thing, right? I don't have a good answer. So I'm trying to, I wouldn't say flog my faculty, so I guess I should say encourage my faculty, because when I go in to meet my dean, the grant dollars are fine. What she focuses on the list of faculty name by name and how much indirect cost return they generated. You know, and the dean's like, that's what I care about. And so that helps me because I can say, this is what our dean said she cares about, guys. So if we're going to look better, you know, we need to be generating revenues for public purposes and not just revenues for private purposes. So I have no answer. It's just a problem or a challenge, I should say, that's becoming bigger over time as the dean emphasizes it more and more. And so I'm just sharing that openly with my faculty. I've not yet publicized a list of names, but I'm probably, you know, a step or two away from that. And the other point is I want to reinforce something that Jordan said, and this is about those commodity groups. And they were also mentioned earlier by other folks. Our commodity groups in California do pay a reduced overhead rate. But the thing is, like you said, once you form a relationship with this commodity group, if it's a good relationship, you have consistent money. But the flip side is true. Don't start getting money from a commodity group unless you're willing to continue to commit to them. Because once they know that Jordan's the guy to go to, then when Jordan says, sorry, I've got too much money, too many commitments, can't do it, they'll remember that when he applies through their call 2 years later. I chair the California Walnut Board, and I've been on their production research committee. These guys have memories like elephants. Okay. So he could have been an assistant professor in 10 years from now if you've been applying for walnut money. That Jordan guy, didn't we in 2010? So that's the other thing, if you're talking about junior faculty, is these are good long-term relationships and they will help you with a reputation, but they can also tank it. And if you've got growers that grow multiple crops and, you know, and they're active on their commodity group boards and that, then that expands further than you think. So see, I got a big nod from him. So yeah, exactly. And it spreads. These folks talk. So then those are my 2 points. And then again, Lori said, well, it can be more general than just looking at grantsmanship. And to some extent, to have this discussion, I would argue that it has to be. All right, that's Zoom. It won't let me.
Yeah, I think if you.
Sweet, let's see. So slideshow from beginning. There we go. Okay, that's my fault for looking at the screen and not looking at the computer. So getting your students hired, all right, so that then they are in a position to decide how to write grants and balancing that with everything else they have to do. So again, I'm going to take a step back in the hiring process. You know, what do we want to do as a department? We want someone who's going to be excellent in teaching, mentoring, research, service, contributions to diversity. Okay. But generally what we're doing is an assessment of potential, right? We're mostly looking at new PhDs or very junior assistant professors. And so research, teaching, diversity statements, you know, all the stuff that we need to manage now in terms of seeing what people can do. It's not just their actual output. It's, you know, what might they do? What can we see about them from that? So we use those things to hire someone who's been successful. And what happens with us is when you think about grant writing, it's about the research statement, but it's also about the teaching statement, because the teaching statement is how you're going to convey information in some sense. And so grant writing is about conveying information about what you want to do in a persuasive way. So just looking at those statements, our assessment of grantsmanship is embedded in those. There is no separate statement. And then we want to hire someone who meets our identified departmental needs. We got to sell positions to the dean and provost, right? And so we need to tell them what the needs are. And then, you know, to some extent, we're accountable for who we hire relative to what we said we wanted. The job candidate wants a job. Okay, that's an easy objective. And they need to be able to demonstrate the department's 2 objectives. Again, so Lori said I could broaden it up. And so here, implicitly, out of the University of California Academic Personnel Manual, that implicit definition is grants are an input, okay? Culturally, that's changed in terms of how this is applied, but if you are strictly, and I mean, this is out of a long multi-page thing about the professor series, but there is no explicit statement that people are evaluated based on grants, but culturally there's more and more the idea that that has to be an element of your research record because of the needs of the institution, as Keith talked about. The other thing, and this is just more, and don't have much time, so I'll skip through this part, but something that's become a big deal at the University of California is an emphasis on diversity, both in hiring and specifically on faculty performance in research and teaching and service. Okay, and so this is another consideration and complication for us. But on the other hand, it gives new opportunities for grantsmanship, right? To the extent that entities are putting out calls for grants to increase diversity, then that is something else that new faculty could do if they have a demonstrated commitment. And I had a couple of associate professors get a large grant from the UC Office of the President to focus on diversity through expanding work with Hispanic serving institutions. Research, these are standard. Again, let's see, what I will just say simply about that is, so the same metrics as faculty for published work, quantity and outlet. I mean, you can say the same thing about grants, but I personally have, how much do you really want to get graduate students involved in writing the actual grants? I mean, so if it's an IFA award, I would argue they shouldn't be touching anything other than the project description and the project summary, okay? I just don't think the value added of learning how to fill out those forms is there for them. Well, it's in some ways, none of us think it's worth it for any of us. So that's not any different. So then I'll move straight to, sorry about those on Zoom. So then I think I'll move straight to the changes and questions again, because this has been fairly focused and, and this was the only broader one. So I think then the two things to think about is how to mentor future faculty through navigating the evolving standards for faculty success. And you see I've got grantsmanship down there. You've gotten my opinion about how valuable it is to participate. That may just be because I'm old, but it is a balancing act in terms of what do we really need to teach them? What, on the other hand, are people evaluating their records going to think about that? Does it have to be, can you just show it as participating in actual grant writing? You surely don't want to spend part of your research statement saying anything explicitly about grants and maybe more than, half a sentence. Because again, looking at the overall research potential. So how do we fit that into the mentoring employment process? It is an open question. And then related to that is what's the role of postdoctoral scholar positions in the discipline? I mean, getting a postdoc involved in writing a grant in more detail, that's something I think is a worthwhile investment for them. And then I've thought, well, more broadly, what are best practices for dealing with postdocs? They're being used more and more and more, right? If everybody who has or has had a postdoc, if I sat you down and said, what are the 5 principles you use for mentoring postdocs? It'd be interesting to see if we had more than 2 or 3 that everyone had. And again, it's broader than grantsmanship, but it's something to think about. How do we prepare people both at the postdoctoral level and the PhD level to go on the market? And if at that level, grantsmanship is more implicit than explicit when you look at the materials that are required in that, how's that going to be integrated into this process, and so into the mentoring for our students. And I think I didn't run us over time. So
anyone have any questions?
I'm curious about the papers. You said how they position evaluation and how you incorporating that information. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I sure can. Again, I threw that in because I didn't know, how broad this is going to be, how much time. So we now have a diversity statement. The university wants us to look at those and see if there's anyone to throw out before we look at any other materials. It's now are supposed to have a diversity statement every time we go up for a merit or promotion. You see you're evaluated every 2 to 3 years by your peers. So then there's institutional, like too little money to at the campus level to promote diversity. So basically it's kind of the Wild West, so there are examples here about the kinds of things that are considered diversity and equity. So, but again, it's really evolving. So they want to see something, but nobody can tell you necessarily exactly what something is. It's like quality, right? It's like the qualitative dimension. So
Thank you.
yep. Anything else? All right. Well, I've thought it was a great session. So thank you guys.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel.